Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something super fascinating, Dr. David Bauer's methodology for actually extracting true meaning from ancient texts. You know, if you've ever stared at a dense historical document, whether that's a piece of classical literature, a founding charter, or an ancient religious manuscript, and thought, man, am I actually getting this interpretation right? Well, you are in the right place. Think of this approach as your ultimate blueprint.
Okay, let's kick things off with the ultimate modern question about reading. Can a text just mean whatever it means to you? It's a hugely popular idea right now, right? This whole concept that the original author's intent doesn't really matter, and the text is basically just a mirror reflecting your own thoughts and feelings back at you. But if we adopt that view, it completely fractures how we interact with history. Honestly, it turns reading from a dynamic conversation into a lonely monologue.
Dr. Bauer argues a hard no on that. It absolutely cannot just mean whatever you want. To understand his objective solution, here is our roadmap. 1. Seeking authorial intent. 2. Implied versus real authors. 3. Human words, divine meaning. 4. The Bible as a library. 5. The architecture of structure. And 6. Analysis and synthesis. Let's get right into it.
Number 1. Seeking authorial intent, which is really the foundation of reading.
So, the crucial point here is that ignoring the author's voice contradicts the very nature of reading itself. Think about it for a second. When you open a letter from a friend or, say, an email from a colleague, the most fundamental reality you experience is the sense that you are being addressed by someone else. You aren't sitting there looking for what the words mean to you. You are trying to figure out what they are trying to tell you. It's a two-way street of communication. Bypassing the author means you simply aren't interpreting the text according to its own nature. You're just, well, talking to yourself.
Which brings us to number 2, implied versus real authors. Exactly who are we listening to?
This leads to a really vital and honestly kind of surprising distinction between the actual historical person who penned the words and the authorial voice that lives inside the text. See, we do not have direct access to that flesh and blood historical figure. That person, sitting at a desk centuries ago, maybe fighting off a headache, worried about the weather, they knew and believed way more than they could ever write down in one sitting. But we don't have access to their whole mind. What we do have access to is the implied author. That's the voice we directly encounter, the specific persona we infer through the surviving text. We've got to limit our interpretation to what that implied voice actually put on the page.
And this brilliantly illustrates why the implied author is actually larger than the flesh and blood author. Texts can take on a total life of their own. The scholar E.D. Hirsch once imagined this great scenario. A modern poet is sitting in a literature class listening to students explain what their poem means. The poet listens, thinks about it, and says, "Yes, I see what you mean, and actually, that is what that passage means, although I didn't consciously intend that when I wrote it." Meaning is just incredibly robust. Once words are structured together, their implications stretch way beyond the immediate conscious thoughts of the person holding the pen.
Moving on to number 3, human words, divine meaning. This is where we get the full sense.
Now, early Christian writers relied heavily on this concept called sensus plenior. It's Latin for the full or plentiful sense. Basically, it's the technical explanation for how a text can hold a richer, deeper, even divine layer of meaning that the original human author might not have even been consciously aware of. As these early scholars pored over ancient Jewish scriptures, they constantly saw historical texts echoing forward into completely new fulfillments.
Let's look at a real-world case study to see how this builds. The Gospel of Matthew takes a historical reference in Hosea about the Exodus and reads a much deeper, full sense into it about Jesus. Now, Hosea was originally writing to an 8th century BC audience about the historical nation of Israel coming out of Egypt. He was looking backward at the past. But Matthew, writing hundreds of years later in the 1st century, looks back at Hosea's words and says, actually, Hosea was saying way more than he knew. This pattern of being called out of Egypt is ultimately fulfilled in Christ. That is sensus plenior in action, respecting the original historical statement while recognizing a massive, broader trajectory of meaning.
But, and this is a big but, we cannot just skip over the human element to get to the spiritual stuff. Dr. Bauer's structural rule here is totally clear. You can only reliably encounter the divine mind by rigorously analyzing the human author's mind first. The text isn't some mystical direct download from the sky. It is mediated entirely through humanity. Taking those human words, their grammar, the historical context, all their humanness, seriously is literally the only gateway to accurate interpretation. There is no shortcut around the hard work of reading.
All right, number 4,
The Bible as a library. Let's look at the macro context.
Context is everything. The foundational rule here is that you cannot uncritically read one book into another, because each was written with its own distinct history, vocabulary, and purpose. As G. Campbell Morgan beautifully stated, we have to view the Bible not as a single uniform book, but as an entire curated library. Think about how you act in a physical library. You wouldn't pull out a 19th century medical journal and read it the exact same way you read a collection of romantic poetry, right? The same exact principle applies here.
This canonical assemblage isn't just one long, continuous narrative written by a single guy over a long weekend. It is 66 distinct books. They span centuries, different continents, totally varying genres. This means the fundamental literary unit of the Bible is actually the individual book itself. You've got to let each book present its own message on its own terms first. You have to hear its unique voice before you start cross-referencing it with the 65 other texts sitting on the shelf.
So how do we navigate this library? That brings us to number 5, the architecture of structure and how we build meaning.
Dr. Bauer looks to use the phrase, things hook an eye together. I love that. Think of it like a Russian nesting doll of structure. Meaning is only derived from how the small parts relate to the larger whole. Words don't mean anything floating around in isolation. Their definitions completely shift based on their context. Words hook into sentences. Sentences build paragraphs. Paragraphs form segments, which ultimately combine to form an entire book. Everything is defined by its relationship to the stuff surrounding it.
Think about it this way. A pile of bricks is not a house. You would never drive by a random pile of lumber and shingles in a driveway and think, what a lovely completed home. The raw materials just aren't enough. It's the intentional arrangement of those materials that creates something functional, something you can actually live in. Words are exactly the same. An author exerts massive amounts of intellectual energy to arrange their words into a very specific architecture.
So the crucial point is that there is simply no such thing as pure floating content. All content comes to us securely bound within its structural form. You've got the stuff, the content, and you have the arrangement, the structure. Add them together and you arrive at true meaning. You literally cannot ignore how a text is built if you want to understand what it says. If a writer places two contrasting ideas side by side, well, that structural contrast is part of the message. Form dictates function.
Finally, number 6, analysis and synthesis, tearing down and rebuilding. This is basically the two-sided coin of methodology. You have to aggressively tear the text down to its studs, but then you've got to carefully build it back up. Analysis forces you to break the passage down into its core components, the grammar, the history, the individual phrases, to see exactly what makes it tick. But you can't just leave it in pieces on the floor. A disassembled engine isn't going to drive you anywhere. Synthesis requires you to connect those parts back together to discern the broader theology. You have to reconstruct the text in your mind to see the big picture. So, how do we turn all this into a practical hermeneutical toolkit? Whether you're an academic theology student, a historian, or just a massive literature nerd, the steps are pretty clear. Start by identifying the implied author's intent. Really listen for their voice. Next, uncover the structural architecture of their writing. Then, read the passage strictly within its specific book context first. And finally, synthesize it by connecting that passage outward to the whole canonical library.
After exploring Dr. Bauer's rigorous approach to moving all the way from the microwords to the macro library, you've really got to ask yourself, how are you going to rebuild the way you read? Are you going to keep just staring at isolated piles of bricks, making them mean whatever you want them to mean? Or are you ready to uncover the magnificent architecture hidden in the text? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Now go start rebuilding.